There is a map in Istanbul that cartographers have been arguing about quietly for 90 years. It was drawn in 1513 by a man named Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral executed in 1553 for reasons that had nothing to do with cartography. The map shows Antarctica, not the vague, theoretical southern continent that European geographers invented for symmetry. A specific coastline, with rivers, with mountain ranges, with features matching subglacial topography confirmed by sonar survey in the 1950s. The continent was not officially discovered until 1820. The map is 307 years older than that discovery. The source documents Piri Reis used were, by his own account, older still. I found it because I was looking for something else. That is how it usually happens. You pull a thread that seems unrelated. A footnote in a book about Ottoman naval history, a reference so brief the author clearly did not think it worth pursuing. And the thread does not end where you expect. It leads somewhere older, somewhere that does not fit inside the frame of the history you thought you understood. The footnote mentioned a map. It named an archive. It gave a date, 1929, the year a palace renovation in Istanbul uncovered a collection of documents that had been folded and stored in a room that had not been opened in generations. Among those documents was a fragment of gazelle skin drawn on in ink that had survived 5 centuries without significant fading, depicting a world that the cartographer who drew it should not have been able to see. The map is real. It sits today in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, catalogued, photographed, studied by a small number of specialists, and largely ignored by the broader institutions that shape what we call the historical consensus. It measures approximately 3 feet by 2 feet. It was drawn in the year 1513 by a man named Piri Reis, full name Haji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer born around 1465 and executed by order of the Ottoman court in 1553 at the approximate age of 88, reportedly for a military failure in the Persian Gulf that his superiors found unforgivable. He was not a guesser, he was a professional. He compiled navigational charts for a living, in an era when accurate charts were a matter of national survival. He worked from sources. He said so himself in the marginal notes he left directly on the map, handwritten annotations in Ottoman Turkish that have since been translated and published, and that contain a sentence that researchers have been quietly arguing about for more than 60 years. He wrote that he compiled the map from approximately 20 source maps. Some of those maps, he noted, dated to the time of Alexander the Great. Set that aside for a moment. We will return to it. What matters first is what the map shows. The map depicts the Atlantic Ocean. The coastlines of Europe and West Africa are rendered with the kind of accuracy you would expect from a skilled 16th century cartographer who had access to recent Portuguese and Spanish navigational records. South America's eastern coastline is there, drawn with impressive fidelity given that European exploration of that coast had only begun roughly 2 decades before Piri Reis sat down with his sources and his ink. And then, at the bottom of the map, there is a landmass. It is drawn below the southern tip of South America. It is continuous, extending across the bottom of the chart, in a curve that follows what we now know to be the general arc of Antarctica. But this is not what makes the map remarkable. 16th century cartographers sometimes drew a theoretical southern continent in that region, a hypothetical mass called Terra Australis Incognita, meaning the unknown southern land, which ancient Greek philosophers had proposed must exist to balance the weight of the land masses in the northern hemisphere. A theoretical drawing of a southern continent would not be surprising. What is surprising is the detail. The landmass on the Piri Reis map shows a coastline that is not a smooth theoretical arc. It shows bays and inlets and promontories, specific, irregular features that match, with an accuracy that has since been confirmed by technical analysis, the actual subglacial coastline of the continent we now call Antarctica. Not the coastline as it appears today, buried under an ice sheet that in some places reaches 2 miles in depth. The coastline as it would have appeared if the ice were removed. The mountain ranges shown on that coastline were not confirmed by modern science until seismic surveys and ice-penetrating radar mapped the subglacial terrain of Antarctica in the 1950s and beyond. The map is dated 1513. Antarctica was not confirmed to exist by any European explorer until 1820. That gap is 307 years. The German theologian and scholar Gustav Wallace is typically credited as the first modern researcher to recognize the significance of the Topkapi discovery, though his initial identification in 1929 was primarily concerned with the map's Atlantic geography. It was not until the 1950s and 60s that the specific question of the Antarctic coastline was subjected to rigorous technical scrutiny. And the results of that scrutiny, when they came, were not published in prominent journals or announced at major conferences. They arrived in a letter. But before we reach the letter, it is important to understand the tradition in which Piri Reis was working. A Portolan chart is a navigational document compiled from multiple source surveys. A cartographer takes soundings, bearings, and observations from many voyages and synthesizes them into a single coherent image. The concept of a compiled map was well understood in the 15th and 16th centuries. Piri Reis was not doing something unusual when he gathered source maps from various origins. He was doing his job. What was unusual was the age he claimed for some of those sources, and what was unusual was what those sources apparently contained. The practice of compilation means that a map can carry knowledge that is older than the map itself. The cartographer who draws the final document did not necessarily sail the coastlines depicted. He copied them from someone who did, or from someone who copied from someone who did, a chain of transmission. Each link in the chain passes the knowledge forward, often without fully understanding where it originated. Piri Reis was at the end of one such chain. How long the chain was and where it began is the question that the map raises and that no institution has since been willing to answer with the resources the question demands. What we know with certainty, the map exists. The archive that holds it is real. The man who drew it was real, a documented historical figure whose other works survive and whose professional reputation within the Ottoman cartographic tradition is not in dispute. The features on the map that correspond to subglacial Antarctic topography are not interpretive. They were confirmed by a technical body whose institutional credibility is not peripheral. And the ice core record tells us that the coastlines shown on this map were last exposed, last visible, last mappable from the surface, approximately 6,000 years ago. The map is 512 years old. The coastlines it depicts have been under ice for roughly 6,000 years. Someone, somewhere, at some point in the long chain of transmission that ends with an Ottoman admiral in the early 16th century, stood on a shore that no one today believes any pre-modern civilization was capable of reaching. Or they had access to records made by someone who did. The gazelle skin in Istanbul does not tell us which. It only tells us that the knowledge existed, that it was preserved long enough to be copied, and that it was sitting in a palace storage room for 4 centuries before anyone in the modern world thought to look. The Piri Reis map was not the only one. That is the fact that changes the weight of everything that came before it. A single anomalous map can be explained away. A lucky guess, a theoretical extrapolation, a cartographer's imagination running ahead of the evidence. One map is in curiosity. What follows is something else. Oronteus Phineus was a French mathematician and cartographer born in 1494 in Briançon, in what is now southeastern France. He died in 1555 in Paris, having spent the productive middle decades of his life producing some of the most technically sophisticated maps in 16th century Europe. In 1531, 18 years after Piri Reis completed his compilation, Phineus published a world map. It showed Antarctica, not a vague southern smear, not a theoretical continent sketched in from philosophical principle. A landmass with interior mountain ranges, with rivers flowing from those mountains toward a defined coastline, with bays and inlets, and a continental profile that matches, in its general contour, the actual shape of Antarctica, as confirmed by 20th century survey. The rivers on the Phineus map do not exist today. They cannot be seen, cannot be sailed, cannot be confirmed by any surface observation available to a 16th century European. They flow beneath the Ross ice shelf, under ice that has been accumulating for thousands of years. Phineus drew them anyway. He drew them because something told him they were there. Philippe Boitier was a French geographer born in 1670 in Croissy-sur-Seine and died in 1773 in Paris, having served as Premier Géographe du Roi, first geographer to the king, for the French crown. In 1754, more than 2 centuries after Phineas and nearly 2.5 centuries after Piri Reis, Boache published a map of the southern polar region. His map showed Antarctica as 2 distinct landmasses separated by a subglacial channel running through the interior of the continent. In 1958, the Norwegian, British, Swedish Antarctic expedition, conducting seismic surveys of the subglacial terrain, confirmed that a channel does in fact divide the Antarctic landmass at approximately the location Boache indicated. The channel is buried under ice. It is not visible from the surface. It has never been visible from the surface in any period of recorded human history. Boache drew it in 1754. Now do the arithmetic. The Ross Ice Shelf, the largest floating sheet of ice on Earth, covering an area roughly the size of France, has been in its current frozen state for approximately 6,000 years. The ice core record from Bird Station, drilled in the 1950s and analyzed over the following decades, places the last period of significant ice-free conditions on the relevant Antarctic coastlines at no earlier than roughly 4,000 BCE. Some analyses extend that estimate further back to 6,000 BCE or beyond. The details are still debated by glaciologists. What is not debated is the general order of magnitude. Whatever existed before the ice, whatever coastlines were visible, whatever rivers ran to the sea, has been locked under 2 miles of ice for somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years. The oldest confirmed human writing dates to roughly 3,400 BCE in Mesopotamia. The earliest known permanent agricultural settlements appear around 10,000 BCE. The period during which those Antarctic coastlines were accessible and mappable predates not just European exploration, but most of what we conventionally call civilization. Someone mapped them. The official explanation for all 3 maps is not unreasonable. It runs like this. Ancient and Renaissance cartographers believed, on theoretical grounds derived from Aristotle and Ptolemy, that a large landmass must exist in the southern hemisphere to counterbalance the weight of the continents in the north. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. They drew it on maps because they expected it to be there, not because they had seen it. When later maps happened to approximate the actual shape of Antarctica, this was coincidence. The product of expectation aligning with reality by chance. The official explanation is reasonable, except that it does not account for the rivers. A theoretical continent drawn from philosophical expectation would be a smooth, coastline-only shape. It would not have interior drainage systems. There is no theoretical reason to draw rivers flowing from mountain ranges to the sea on a continent you believe exists, but have never visited. You cannot derive the existence of a specific subglacial river system from Aristotelian balance theory. You cannot guess a channel through the interior of a landmass you have never seen, and then have that channel confirmed by seismic survey 200 years later. The general shape of a theoretical continent is a guess. The specific internal geography is not. This is what separates the 3 maps from the category of lucky coincidence. Each one contains interior details, drainage systems, subglacial channels, mountain ranges feeding river networks, that correspond to features only confirmed by modern subglacial survey equipment in the mid-20th century. Features that are not visible from the surface. Features that could not be extrapolated from philosophical principle. 3 cartographers, 3 separate centuries, 3 separate national traditions. Ottoman, French twice over. The same subglacial geography, rendered with varying degrees of accuracy on maps that should not exist. Consider what it would mean if even one of those maps were accurate by genuine observation rather than by chance. Consider what kind of observation would be required. Someone would have to have sailed those coastlines when they were still coastlines, when the ice was absent, or thin enough to permit navigation of the interior waterways. Someone would have to have surveyed the interior, mapped the rivers, noted the mountains. Someone would have to have recorded all of that on a document durable enough to survive the millennia separating the observation from the copying. And then someone would have to have copied it, passed it forward, kept it alive through whatever disasters intervened, for it to appear in Istanbul in 1513, in Paris in 1531, and in Paris again in 1754. The knowledge would have to have survived inside some chain of transmission, A library, a tradition, an archive capable of holding it across thousands of years. There is only one institution in the ancient world whose documented holdings were large enough and whose geographic position was central enough to have served as that repository. The question of where Piri Reis obtained his ancient maps leads, every time, to the same place. It leads to a city on the Egyptian coast, to a building that does not exist anymore, to a collection of documents that was, by any reasonable historical standard, the largest single repository of human knowledge that existed before the modern era, and whose destruction we have been treating for 2,000 years as an acceptable loss. In the summer of 1960, a United States Air Force officer sat down and wrote a letter that should have changed everything. The officer was Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, commanding officer of the 881st Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, a unit whose professional function was the analysis of aerial and cartographic intelligence. He was not a fringe researcher. He was not an amateur enthusiast working from a home library. He was a senior military officer whose institutional credibility rested entirely on his ability to read maps accurately and assess what they showed. He wrote to Charles Hapgood, a professor of history and anthropology at Keene State College in New Hampshire, born in 1894 and died in 1982, who had spent several years corresponding with the Air Force's cartographic divisions about a specific technical problem. Hapgood had been studying the Piri Reis map and had submitted his analysis to the Air Force for review. Not to a fringe publication, not to a conspiracy newsletter, but to the professional military body responsible for evaluating cartographic accuracy. Ohlmeyer's reply confirmed what Hapgood had concluded. The letter, dated July 6, 1960, states that the Air Force's cartographic squadron had examined the Piri Reis map and found that it does indeed show the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, the region of Antarctica directly south of the Atlantic Ocean, with what Ohlmeyer described as remarkable accuracy. The squadron confirmed that the coastline features depicted on the 1513 map correspond to features that were not confirmed by modern survey until aerial reconnaissance and seismic imaging equipment became available in the mid-20th century. Remarkable accuracy. Those are the words of the United States Air Force, written in an official communication addressed to a credentialed academic, filed and preserved and available in public archives to this day. The institutional response to this finding was silence. No follow-up study was commissioned. No formal report was published by the cartographic squadron. The letter exists. The confirmation exists. The investigation it should have prompted does not. What the Air Force analysis also confirmed, though Ohlmeyer's letter addresses it only indirectly, is the projection geometry of the map itself. The Piri Reis map is not drawn on a simple flat grid. It is constructed using what cartographic analysis has since identified as a Lambert azimuthal equal area projection, a mathematically precise method of representing a spherical surface on a flat plane while minimizing distortion of area. The projection is centered, the technical analysis indicates, on a point in the vicinity of Cairo, Egypt. The Lambert azimuthal equal area projection was not formally described by European mathematics until the work of Johann Heinrich Lambert, a Swiss mathematician born in 1728 and died in 1777, who published the projection in 1772. That is 259 years after the Piri Reis map was drawn. The map uses a mathematical projection that European mathematics had not yet invented. The official explanation for this is that the correspondence between the map's geometry and the Lambert projection is approximate rather than exact, that Piri Reis may have assembled his source charts in a way that happened to produce a similar distortion pattern without deliberately employing a named mathematical method. The explanation is reasonable, except that an accidental approximation of a sophisticated equal area projection centered on a specific geographic point, producing accurate subglacial coastline features across a landmass that was not visited by any European explorer for 3 more centuries, requires the coincidences to stack in a way that begins to strain the word coincidence beyond its functional meaning. The physical evidence does not come only from cartographic analysis. In the late 1950s, the United States military conducted deep ice core drilling at Byrd Station, a research installation located at approximately 80 degrees south latitude in West Antarctica. The cores extracted from that drilling provided a continuous record of Antarctic ice accumulation extending back tens of thousands of years. The analysis of those cores, published across a series of scientific papers in the 1960s, confirmed that the coastlines of Queen Maud Land, the specific region shown on the Peary Race map, were last free of significant ice accumulation during a period that ended somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era. That range places the last ice-free window for those coastlines within the period of early human civilization, not prehistory in the sense of the remote and unrecoverable past, the period of early Mesopotamian writing, the period of the first Egyptian dynasties, the period during which human beings were, for the first time, building structures intended to outlast a single generation. Someone was mapping coastlines during that period. Someone recorded what they found. Peary Race told us this himself in his own hand. The marginal notes on the 1513 map, written in Ottoman Turkish and translated by multiple scholars over the past century, contain a passage in which the admiral describes his sources. He writes that he compiled the map from approximately 20 charts and mappae mundi. He specifies that some of these source documents dated to the era of Alexander the Great, Alexander III of Macedon, born in 356 BCE and died in 323 BCE, placing the origin of at least some of his source material more than 18 centuries before he drew the map that incorporated it. He was not speculating, he was citing his bibliography. The question is not whether Peary Race had access to older maps. He said he did. The question is where those maps came from, how far back their own sources extended, and what institution was capable of preserving cartographic knowledge for long enough that an Ottoman admiral in the 16th century could still access charts that traced their lineage to the time of Alexander. And then there is the simultaneity. 3 maps, 3 cartographers, 3 separate centuries. 1513, 1531, 1754. 3 separate national traditions, Ottoman, French, French again. All 3 show Antarctic coastal and interior features that were not confirmed by modern survey until the 1950s. The Peary Race map shows the Queen Maud Land coastline. The Oronteus Phineas map shows interior drainage systems flowing from mountain ranges to the sea. The Boache map shows the sub-glacial channel dividing the continent into 2 land masses, each feature confirmed. None of the 3 maps can be explained by the others. They come from different sources, different centuries, different cartographic traditions. Yet they converge on the same geography with a consistency that cannot be attributed to shared imagination. 3 independent data points do not make a coincidence. They make a pattern. The pattern points backward through the centuries of transmission toward a single question. What was the institution large enough, old enough, and central enough to have held this knowledge and passed it forward across the millennia until it reached a palace library in Constantinople, in the hands of an Ottoman admiral who would copy it onto gazelle skin, and then, 60 years later, be executed before anyone thought to ask him where it came from? The question Peary Race answered in his own marginal notes was the simpler one. He told us he used older maps. What he did not tell us, what he could not have told us because he almost certainly did not know, was where those older maps came from before they reached him. The chain of transmission runs backward from his hand through a series of intermediaries, and at some point in that backward journey, the chain passes through a city on the Egyptian coast, whose name has become so attached to mythology that we sometimes forget it was also, quite literally, a building. The Library of Alexandria was not a legend. It was an institution founded under Ptolemy I Soter, who was born around 367 BCE in Macedonia and died around 283 BCE in Alexandria. Construction on the library and its associated research complex, the Mouseion, began in approximately 300 BCE and continued under subsequent Ptolemaic rulers for decades. At its height, the library's holdings were estimated by ancient sources to include between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, a range that reflects the difficulty ancient administrators had in counting documents that arrived continuously and were cataloged by a professional staff. Ancient administrators keeping records of documents they received. Librarians doing their jobs. The holdings were not random. The library was specifically tasked with collecting works from across the known world, and it pursued that mandate aggressively. Ships docking at Alexandria were required by Ptolemaic law to surrender any scrolls on board for copying. The copies were returned to the ships, and the originals were retained by the library. The library sent agents to acquire texts from as far east as India and as far west as the Iberian Peninsula. Whatever existed before in fragmented repositories across the ancient Mediterranean, navigational records, geographical surveys, astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, was systematically drawn toward this single location on the Egyptian coast. If the source maps for the Piri Reis compilation had a single institutional home in the ancient world, the Library of Alexandria is the only institution large enough and geographically positioned correctly to have held them. The library did not survive. This is the part that the historical record states plainly, without drama, as a series of dates and events that individually sound routine and collectively represent the largest single loss of documented human knowledge in recorded history. Julius Caesar, during his campaign in Alexandria in 48 BCE, accidentally ignited a fire near the harbor district that destroyed a warehouse containing an estimated 40,000 scrolls that had been quarantined for shipping. This was not the library itself. The main library survived, but it was a significant portion of the library's overflow holdings. The fire was accidental. Caesar himself noted it in his accounts. The loss was real. The library continued to operate through the first century of the Common Era, diminished but functional. The Roman Emperor Aurelian, conducting military operations in Alexandria in 272 CE, destroyed the Brucaian district, the royal quarter of the city that housed the main library complex. The scrolls that were in that building when Aurelian's forces moved through did not survive the campaign. The loss was collateral. The campaign had other objectives. The daughter library, the Serapeum, continued to function for another century. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict ordering the destruction of pagan temples throughout the empire. The Serapeum, which was both a temple and a library, was destroyed by a Christian mob acting in accordance with the spirit of the imperial edict. The Bishop of Alexandria at the time, Theophilus, born around 345 CE and died in 412 CE, oversaw the demolition and reported it as a religious victory. Whatever remained of the Alexandrian cartographic tradition in that building ended that year. The Arab conquest of Alexandria in 642 CE is sometimes cited as the final destruction of the library. The historical record on this event is contested. The primary sources are late, and the specifics are disputed among scholars. What is not disputed is that by 642 CE, whatever had survived the preceding centuries of war, fire, and deliberate destruction was reduced to fragments. The great chain of knowledge, if it still existed at all, existed in copies of copies held in dispersed private collections across the Arab world. One destruction, accidental. One destruction, collateral. One destruction, religious mandate. One destruction, disputed. Each step, in isolation, follows its own internal logic. That is what makes the sequence sinister, not malice necessarily. Process. Each institution acting within its own frame of reference, each event producing its own justification, the aggregate effect indistinguishable from a coordinated elimination of a specific category of knowledge. And it was not only Alexandria. In 1562, Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar born in 1524 in Cifuentes, Spain, and died in 1579 in Yucatan, conducted what he called an act of faith in the town of Mani in the Yucatan Peninsula. He ordered the public burning of all Mayan codices that could be collected from the surrounding communities. Contemporary accounts describe the burning of 27 known codex rolls, along with 5,000 separate cult objects. De Landa himself recorded the event in his account of Yucatan, the same account that also, incidentally, preserved much of what we know about the Mayan calendar and writing system, a preservation achieved through interviews with surviving scholars whose books he had just destroyed. Of the hundreds of Mayan codices that are estimated to have existed before the Spanish conquest of the Yucatan, 4 survive today in fragmentary form. 4. The justification was religious. The mechanism was bureaucratic. A friar acting under the authority of his order, conducting a formally designated auto de fe, filing a report that is now stored in a Spanish archive. Each step plausible on its own. In the Ottoman Empire across the mid-16th century, a process of administrative consolidation led to the reclassification and restricted access of holdings in the Imperial Palace Archive in Constantinople, the same palace that would later undergo the renovation in 1929 that recovered the Piri Reis map. The reclassification was not a burning. Nothing was destroyed as far as the record shows. The materials were simply moved into restricted categories, accessible only to authorized imperial administrators, removed from the circulation through which Piri Reis himself had previously been able to access the documents he used to compile his 1513 map. Piri Reis was executed in 1553. The reclassification of the palace archive occurred across the same decade. His personal working collection, the source maps, the notes, the additional compilations he produced over a 40-year career as the empire's most accomplished naval cartographer, was dispersed after his death, as the property of an executed official reverts under Ottoman administrative law. What the 1929 renovation recovered was one map. In August of 1946, the United States Navy began assembling the largest polar expedition in recorded history. The operation was designated Task Force 68 under the command of Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, born in 1888 in Winchester, Virginia, and died in 1957 in Boston, Massachusetts. Byrd was not an obscure figure. He had made 4 previous Antarctic expeditions, received the Medal of Honor from Congress, and was the most publicly recognized polar explorer in American history. When he spoke about Antarctica, the press listened. The force assembled for Operation High Jump, the expedition's working name, comprised 14 ships, including an aircraft carrier, a submarine, 2 destroyer escorts, 2 seaplane tenders, and multiple support vessels. The personnel count reached 4,700 men. The stated mission, as described in the Navy's official documentation, was scientific research, mapping, meteorological observation, and the training of personnel in cold weather operations. The expedition departed in December of 1946 and operated in Antarctic waters through February of 1947. In that period, the aerial survey teams photographed approximately 70% of the Antarctic coastline, the most comprehensive aerial photographic survey of the continent that had ever been conducted. The photographs were taken systematically with overlapping coverage designed to produce accurate cartographic composites. Among the regions photographed was Queen Maud Land. The aerial survey of Queen Maud Land conducted during Operation High Jump represented the first systematic photographic documentation of the specific coastline depicted on the Piri Reis map of 1513. The photographs taken during those overflights, had they been published and compared against the Piri Reis map's coastline features, would have constituted the most direct empirical test of the map's accuracy ever conducted. The photographs were not fully published. The official explanation is that much of the aerial photography from High Jump required extended processing, classification review under standard military security protocols, and administrative cataloging before public release. The official explanation is reasonable. Military expeditions routinely classify portions of their findings. Administrative delay is common. Security review of aerial photography in the early Cold War period was standard procedure. Reasonable, except that the specific surveys of Queen Maud Land remained restricted for a period extending well beyond the normal classification review window, and the comprehensive photographic archive was not made available to civilian cartographic researchers for decades. The Ohlmeyer letter of 1960, the Air Force's confirmation that the Piri Reis map shows subglacial Queen Maud Land topography with remarkable accuracy, was written 13 years after High Jump completed its survey of that same coastline. The Ohlmeyer letter makes no reference to the High Jump photographs. The Air Force cartographic analysis and the Navy's aerial survey appear in the documentary record to have proceeded in parallel without formal coordination. Each institution operated within its own administrative structure. Before the classification review was complete, before the photographs were processed and restricted, Byrd spoke to the press. In March of 1947, returning from the expedition, he gave a statement to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, in which he described encountering conditions in Antarctica that he had not anticipated and that he believed warranted serious strategic attention. The precise content of that statement has been subject to varying translations and interpretations in the decades since. What is consistent across multiple contemporary accounts is that Byrd described the continent as presenting conditions he had not encountered in his previous 4 expeditions, and that he expressed the view that Antarctica merited significantly greater international attention than it was then receiving. 6 weeks later, the classification review of the expedition's findings began. The pattern by this point has a shape. It is not necessary to claim coordination. It is not necessary to claim that anyone sat in a room and decided deliberately to prevent the confirmation of an ancient map's accuracy. What the documentary record shows is something more unsettling than deliberate suppression. It shows institutional process producing, through entirely routine mechanisms, the same outcome that deliberate suppression would have produced. Ancient records destroyed through a combination of accident, religious mandate, military campaign, and administrative reclassification. Modern confirmations delayed, restricted, or filed without follow-up. The scholarly consensus maintaining that pre-modern knowledge of Antarctica is impossible, not because the evidence has been examined and found wanting, but because the evidence has not been examined at all. The timeline, stripped to its sequence, runs like this. Approximately 6,000 years before the Common Era, the coastlines of Queen Maud Land are last free of significant ice cover, accessible to observation and navigation, capable of being mapped by anyone with a boat and an instrument. Approximately 300 BCE, the Library of Alexandria is founded and begins its systematic collection of geographical and navigational records from across the known world. 48 BCE, Julius Caesar's campaign in Alexandria results in the destruction of an estimated 40,000 scrolls in a harbor warehouse. The main library survives. The holdings are diminished. 272 CE. The Emperor Aurelian destroys the Brucheion district of Alexandria during military operations. The main library is eliminated. 391 CE. The Emperor Theodosius issues an edict against pagan temples. The Serapeum, the daughter library, is destroyed by a Christian mob under the supervision of Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria. 642. The Arab conquest of Alexandria completes whatever remained of the Alexandrian archive's dissolution. 1513. Piri Reis, working in Constantinople, compiles a world map from approximately 20 source documents, some of which he identifies as dating to the era of Alexander the Great. The map shows the subglacial coastline of Queen Maud Land with accuracy later confirmed by modern survey. 1531. Orontius Phineas, working in Paris, publishes a world map showing Antarctica with interior drainage systems flowing from mountain ranges to a defined coastline. The rivers depicted do not exist above the current ice sheet. 1553. Piri Reis is executed by order of the Ottoman court. His personal archive is dispersed. 1562. Diego de Landa burns the Mayan codices at Mani. Of hundreds of codices, 4 survive. 1754. Felipe Boache publishes a map showing Antarctica as 2 landmasses divided by a subglacial channel. The channel is confirmed by seismic survey in 1958. 1946 to 1947, Operation High Jump conducts the first comprehensive aerial photographic survey of the Antarctic coastline, including Queen Maud Land. The findings enter classification review. 1960. Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer of the United States Air Force confirms in writing that the Piri Reis map shows subglacial Queen Maud Land topography with remarkable accuracy. No institutional follow-up is commissioned. 1958. Seismic survey confirms the subglacial channel shown on Boache's 1754 map. Not coincidence, pattern. Each event has its own explanation. Each institution had its own reason: fire, military necessity, religious mandate, administrative process, standard security review, scholarly consensus maintained by the absence of funding for research that challenges it. Every step plausible on its own, every step in sequence, producing the same result. A window of prehistory that cannot be confirmed, surrounded by the institutional wreckage of every mechanism that might have confirmed it. The knowledge existed, the record shows that it existed. The record also shows with the same fidelity what happened to the places that held it. Somewhere, a person sat down with a map they did not fully understand and copied it onto fresh material. We do not know this person's name, we do not know the city they worked in, or the institution that employed them, or the language they spoke when they looked up from the document in front of them and considered what they were looking at. We know they existed because their work survived long enough to reach someone else, who copied it again, who passed it to someone else, across a chain of transmission so long and so fragile that it is difficult to think about without a specific kind of quiet vertigo. The knowledge of those Antarctic coastlines did not arrive in Piri Reis's hands through revelation. It arrived through labor. Someone surveyed, someone recorded, someone stored the record in a place durable enough to outlast them. Someone else found it there and understood, at least partially, what it represented. That person passed it forward, then the next person, then the next. Across thousands of years, across the collapse of civilizations and the destruction of archives and the bureaucratic erasure of entire categories of knowledge, the record moved forward through human hands until it reached a palace library in Constantinople, and an Ottoman admiral who recognized it as something worth including in his compilation. That chain had many links. We can identify only a few of them. The Library of Alexandria received geographical and cartographic records from across the known world for nearly 3 centuries before its first major destruction in 48 BCE. Arab scholars working in the 7th through 13th centuries of the Common Era preserved and transmitted significant portions of whatever Alexandrian knowledge had survived into the early Islamic period, including geographical and astronomical texts that form the foundation of medieval Islamic cartography. The great cartographer Muhammad al-Idrisi, born in 1000 CE in Chota and died in approximately 1165 CE in Sicily, produced his world map, the Tabula Rogeriana, in 1154, working from a tradition of Arabic geographical knowledge that traced its lineage directly to the Alexandrian holdings. That tradition passed through a series of institutions and scholars across the Arab world, each one copying, synthesizing, preserving what had reached them. From that tradition into the Ottoman Imperial Archive in Constantinople, into the hands of Piri Reis. Each link in the chain held, then in 1553, the chain broke. The execution of Piri Reis was ordered by the Ottoman court on the grounds of his failure to relieve the Portuguese siege of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, a military judgment that his contemporaries disputed and that historians have continued to debate in the centuries since. Whatever the justification, the consequence for the documentary record was immediate and irreversible. Under Ottoman administrative law, the property of an executed official, including his personal professional archive, reverted to the state and was subject to dispersal. Piri Reis had spent approximately 40 years as the empire's senior naval cartographer. He had produced multiple maps, written 2 editions of his navigational manual, the Kitabi Bahriye, and compiled what his own marginal notes suggest was a substantial working collection of source documents, including the ancient charts he cited in 1513. That collection was dispersed in 1553. The palace renovation of 1929 recovered 1 map from the storage rooms of Topkapi Palace, 1 fragment from the working archive of a 40-year career. Whatever else Piri Reis compiled, whatever other source maps he held, whatever additional copies of ancient charts he had assembled over 4 decades of working at the center of the Ottoman cartographic tradition, none of it has been recovered. 1 map, drawn on gazelle skin, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, folded and stored and left in a room that was not opened for generations. What remains accessible today is distributed across 3 cities and several institutions, each holding a piece of a record that has never been systematically assembled. The Piri Reis map of 1513 is held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It is catalogued, photographed, and available for scholarly examination by credentialed researchers who submit the appropriate requests through the appropriate administrative channels. The Oronteus Phineas World Map of 1531 is held in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, the National Library of France, an institution founded in 1368, whose holdings include one of the largest cartographic collections in the world. The Philippe Boitier map of 1754 exists in multiple institutional collections across Europe. Charles Hapgood's correspondence with Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, including the 1960 letter confirming the Peary-Rice map's subglacial accuracy, is preserved in public archives and has been cited in published scholarship. The material exists, it is not hidden, it is not classified. It sits in reading rooms and archival drawers and digitized collections, waiting for the question that will finally be asked of it, with the resources and the institutional support that the question requires. In 2013, the British Antarctic Survey and a consortium of international research institutions completed the most comprehensive subglacial topographic survey of Antarctica ever conducted. The survey, known as BedMap-2, combined decades of ice-penetrating radar data, seismic measurements, and satellite observations to produce a detailed map of the Antarctic continent as it exists beneath the ice. The coastlines, the mountain ranges, the drainage systems, the subglacial channels. It is the most accurate picture of ice-free Antarctica that has ever existed. It is publicly available. No institution has funded a systematic, peer-reviewed comparison of all surviving pre-modern maps against the BedMap-2 data. The work has not been done. This is not an absence of evidence, it is an absence of will. Institutional, financial, scholarly. The consensus that forecloses the investigation is maintained not by evidence that the maps are wrong, but by the assumption that they must be, because the civilization capable of producing them cannot, within the current framework of human prehistory, have existed. The assumption may be correct. The theory has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. What has been proven is that the maps exist, that the Ohlmeyer letter exists, that the BedMap-2 survey exists, that the comparison between them has not been made by any institution with the credibility and resources to make it matter. The gazelle skin in Istanbul has been waiting 512 years. It does not require anything from us. It does not need to be rescued or vindicated or explained. It is patient in the way that physical objects are patient. Without awareness, without urgency, without the capacity for disappointment, it simply remains. In a cabinet, in a museum, in a city on the Bosphorus, folded along creases that were made by hands we cannot name, in a language that the cartographer believed would outlast him. It has. The coastlines are still there, the rivers are still drawn. The subglacial geography of a continent that has been buried under 2 miles of ice for 6,000 years is still visible in ink on skin, in a room you could enter, in a building that is open to the public, on a morning when you decided to look.